9. Chieftain ARRV. In June of 2023, a vehicle enthusiast and YouTuber from Leicestershire, England named Joe Hughes posted footage of the recovery of a Chieftain armored repair and recovery vehicle. Unfortunately, the host didn't share any specific information about the ARRV's backstory. According to the Tank Museum in Bovington, UK, an ARRV's main purpose was to recover damaged main battle tanks from the battlefield. So while it looks like a tank itself, it actually wasn't. The Chieftain ARRV appears to be one of the seemingly countless variants of the Chieftain tank, which functioned as Britain's main battle tank from the 1960s to the 90s. Measuring more than 34 feet long and weighing 62 tons, these gargantuan vehicles don't appear to have a particularly active history, and most didn't see much, if any, fighting throughout their careers. 8. SS Sagang. Built during the 1920s, the 455-foot British passenger and cargo ship SS Sagang routinely travelled between Liverpool, England and the Burmese city of Rangoon, while occasionally sailing other routes, including North America and the Caribbean. In 1939, the Sagang was travelling in the North Atlantic with a merchant convoy when a German U-boat chased after and shot torpedoes at it. Luckily, the ship escaped serious harm, although several passengers who boarded the lifeboat were lost at sea. The ship's luck ran out in early 1942 after departing from Glasgow with the top-secret munitions cargo on board. After leaving the port of Colombo in Sri Lanka for Trincomalee Harbour, the crew received a warning that a Japanese attack was likely. For the next several days, the Sagang remained at Trincomalee while it waited through several false alarms and attack warnings. Then, out of nowhere, it was struck during an air raid. The captain was incapacitated, and the vessel quickly began to take on water and list. As the attack continued, a fire broke out. Crew members rushed to prepare the lifeboats for launching, and most of the passengers and cargo were saved. In 2013, what's left of the crumbling ship was deliberately scuttled in about 35 feet of water as a pier for naval ships. 4 years later, workers embarked on a 5-month effort to raise and move the vessel to make more room in the harbour. The wreck was re-scuttled outside the harbour, where it remains to this day. 7. Douglas Dauntless Dive Bomber SBD-2P. From 1943 to 1945, 17,000 US Navy pilots, officers, and other personnel secretly trained on aircraft carriers that were stationed at Chicago on Lake Michigan. According to MLive.com, about a dozen pilots died, and over 100 aircraft ended up on the bottom of the lake. As of 2016, around 40 of the planes had been recovered. Included among them was a Douglas Dauntless Dive Bomber SBD-2P, which was pulled from the lake in 2009. The aircraft's last pilot, Lieutenant John Lendo, made an emergency landing during a training mission in February 1944. Lendo survived, but the plane plunged 200 feet to the frigid lake bottom. It was in surprisingly intact condition when it was recovered 66 years later, owing to the dark, cold, and salt-free waters it came to rest in. After undergoing an extensive restoration, the dive bomber was put on display at the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum in Honolulu. The SBD Dauntless was the US Navy's main carrier-based scout plane and dive bomber from mid-1940 to mid-1944, despite being considered obsolete before the war began. Throughout the conflict, the aircraft sank at least 18 warships and more than 300,000 tons of enemy shipping. It earned its reputation as a sturdy and maneuverable plane during the Battle of Midway in 1942, when it helped secure an Allied victory by sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and according to some, the Dauntless sank more Japanese carriers than any other plane. Have you ever sat in a tank? Tell us about it in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. P38 Lightning. 22-year-old Second Lieutenant Milo E. Rundle was a long way from his home in Iowa when he got lost while flying over Northern Ireland in December 1942. Left with no other choice, he bailed from his P-38 Lightning aircraft. Rundle survived both the crash and the war and lived until 2006, but the less fortunate plane crashed into a field near Castle Blaney in County Monaghan. Most of the wreckage was recovered in 1942 by members of the Irish Defence Forces, and until relatively recently, it was believed they'd retrieved all of it. But in 2019, a ground-penetrating radar survey revealed that some parts of the plane were still buried at the crash site. A team of experts and students dug what was left of the aircraft up in the first ever licensed excavation of an American fighter plane on Irish soil. There weren't many parts and they were in poor condition, but the discovery was nevertheless fascinating for those who participated in the project. They got in touch with Rundle's daughter, Meryl, who was also thrilled by the news and said she was considering a trip to Ireland to see the artifacts on display at local museums. She told the press that if her father were still alive, he would have said, "I just did my job. Why would anyone care about my old P-38? 5. LVT-4 Buffalo Tank. During a series of devastating floods in 1947, an American-made amphibious LVT-4 Buffalo Tank was used as part of a temporary dam in the English village of Crowland, Lincolnshire. The 26-foot-long vehicle's purpose was to help hold back the waters of the nearby River Welland, but the defense proved no match for the raging current. The Buffalo and several other tanks were washed away, and the tank in question ended up in a hole. 74 years later, in 2021, a team set out to recover the vehicle, which had become buried in nearly 30 feet of clay and peat. They were shocked to discover that it was in an extremely well-preserved state, owing to the lack of oxygen in the environment where it sat for 3/4 of a century. Daniel Abbott, who located the tank, told the Daily Mail that when the team began cleaning the tank, they found people's names etched into it. At the time, they weren't sure if the engravings were made during World War II or around the time of the floods. They also identified a hand-painted bull's head symbol representing the British Army's 79th Armoured Division. Built between mid-1941 and mid-1945, the LVT is an amphibious vehicle and landing craft that was originally used for carrying cargo from ships to shore. Over time, it evolved into an assault and fire support vehicle. More than 8,000 LVT-4s were produced, but surviving examples are rare. After being raised from the ground in Crowland, the LVT-4 recovered by Abbott and his crew underwent a full restoration. It was in such good condition that the team got some of its components working, and they said they were pretty confident that they could get the tank itself running. Unfortunately, there have been no updates on whether or not it ended up happening. 4. The Maud. In 1918, the famous Norwegian polar explorer Roald Amundsen tried to cross the North Pole on a ship called the Maud via a route known as the Northeast Passage. After failing to achieve his goals after 6 grueling winters at sea, he shifted his focus away from sailing and set his sights on reaching the North Pole in an aerial expedition. Amundsen eventually went bankrupt, and the Maud was sold to the Hudson Shipping Company in Canada, which used it as a floating warehouse. It sank in 1930 in Cambridge Bay off the coast of Nunavut, where it sat for over 80 years before a crew began attempting to raise it. In 2016, after multiple previous attempts to retrieve the Maud as part of a project called Maud Returns Home, a crew finally lifted the wreck out of the water. The ship returned to its home country, Norway, the following year via the Northwest Passage, spending the winter in Greenland along the way. Finally, in 2018, nearly a century after departing for Amundsen's unsuccessful polar expedition, the Maud arrived back in Norway. According to the most recent updates, there are plans to build a new museum building for housing the Maud, which sits in the waters off the village of Tofte, with a protective roof shielding her from the elements. 3. Spitfire P074. American pilot Roland Bud Wolfe joined the British war effort against Nazi Germany while the US was still neutral. Shortly after taking off from Northern Ireland for a patrol mission in 1941, the engine of his Mark IIA Spitfire fighter plane overheated and failed, forcing him to bail. Wolfe survived, and the plane crashed into a bog on Ireland's Inishowen Peninsula. He was held at an internment camp in the neutral Republic of Ireland for a few weeks before he escaped and took a train back to his base. Wolfe was ultimately sent back to the camp because the British didn't want to upset a neutral country, but he managed to escape a second time. After having his US citizenship stripped for joining the British military, he was welcomed into the American forces in 1943 and was allowed back into the country after the war. Wolfe's Spitfire remained buried in the bog until 2011, when an excavation team recovered it from beneath 30 feet of clay. The plane was in shockingly intact condition, owing to the nearly oxygen-free conditions it sat in for 70 years. While the aircraft itself was taken to a museum in Derry for display, the tailwheel was given to the city of Derry Airport, where Wolfe's All-American unit was stationed during the war. 2. Valentine Tank. The most heavily produced British World War II tank was the Vickers Valentine Tank. Nearly 8,300 of the 17.8-foot vehicles were built between 1940 and 1944, accounting for an estimated quarter of British wartime tank production. The Valentine Tank was used most extensively in the North African campaign and by the USSR, which received large numbers of the vehicles from Britain. It was built under license in Canada, which committed to helping the Allies and establish its own tank-building facilities before the United States entered the war. The vehicle first saw service during a military operation in Egypt and Libya against the Axis powers codenamed Operation Crusader. It earned a reputation for being strong and reliable while facing some of the world's most challenging conditions. While the Valentine served its purpose well, it was rendered obsolete by the end of the war and was used very little afterward. The last known use of the tank was during the Cyprus crisis of 1963 to 1964. In 2012, a group of vintage tank hunters pulled a Valentine tank out of the Water River in western Poland. It was the first tank of its kind ever found in the country. The tank most likely fell through ice and sank while en route to Berlin with the Red Army when it was on its way to attack the city. Prior to the discovery, only 3 Lend-Lease Valentines were known to still exist, and none had seen combat. Before embarking on the recovery operation, divers entered the river and took a look at the Valentine. They were pleased to discover that it was in exceptional condition for its age. After 3 failed attempts to get it out of the water, the team was finally successful. While they said they hoped to restore the tank to driving condition, it's unfortunately unclear what became of the vehicle following the recovery. Based on a list of surviving Valentine tanks that was published in early 2023, it sadly looked somewhat neglected and was slated to become part of a collection owned by Polish actor Jacek Kopczynski Collection. 1. Yangtze Estuary No. 2. Spanning a 3,900-mile distance from the Tibetan Plateau to the East China Sea, China's Yangtze River is Asia's longest waterway. For centuries, it's functioned as a major cargo and passenger route, and it also played a vital role in warfare and the expansion of Imperial China. In 2015, researchers discovered a remarkably preserved ancient merchant ship sitting at the bottom of the Yangtze near Shanghai at a depth of just 16 feet. They identified it as a vessel that sailed sometime between 1862 and 1875 during the Qing dynasty. Following the discovery, divers recovered a trove of artifacts, including blue and white porcelain, purple clay pottery, and other cups, bowls, and plates bearing ornate designs and distinct coloring. Experts trace their origins to Vietnam and a city in China's Yangtze province that was once known as the porcelain capital. The wreck was raised in 2022 after years of planning, revealing one of the country's largest and most intact wooden vessels ever found. Known simply as Yangtze Estuary No. 2, the ship measures 125 feet long and 32 feet wide and has 31 cabins. To safely pull it out of the water, researchers built a watertight chamber and slowly lifted the ship, which took several hours. They found even more artifacts including iron anchors, Vietnamese hooker tanks, and more exquisitely decorated dining ware. Efforts to fully explore and preserve the wreck are ongoing. Thanks for watching. Which one of these impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.